Welcome everyone to the VUB Research Chair in Surveillance Studies panel. My name is Rosamunde van Brakel. I'm a research professor at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. And I am the person coordinating the chair, and the chair was established in 2019 and aims to stimulate research in surveillance studies and create a knowledge hub in surveillance studies at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. Now, since the early 1960s, especially in the United States, different civilian oversight programs have been developed in the hope of ensuring greater police accountability and community trust. Many programs were established in response to concerns expressed in the community about police accountability and police violence. However, more recently, such initiatives play an increasing role in oversight of police investment and deployment of surveillance technologies. Little, however, is known about the effectiveness of such initiatives, and often when mentioning ethics committees, people respond skeptical, and according to, for example, Sylvie Delacroix and Ben Wagner in a new article, when the word ethical becomes synonymous with specious, you know that something is amiss. With evaluating these policy measures, it is difficult to make broad generalities as practices are so diverse. Now, considering that surveillance contributes actively to discrimination and cumulative disadvantage of marginalized and vulnerable groups in society, and the police is increasingly experimenting and deploying new surveillance technologies, questions arise if current oversight mechanisms are efficient to protect citizens from human rights violations and safeguard democracy. This panel aims to discuss the possibilities and pitfalls of civic participation in democratic oversight of surveillance. And we have invited 4 stellar speakers to present their views on this issue from their research or experience. First up, there is Marion Oswald, who will talk about her experiences of working together with the West Midlands Police in the United Kingdom as chair of their ethics committee. After Marion, we will hear from Kirin Eichmann, who will shine her light on this topic coming from a human rights perspective. Koen Gorissen will provide his perspective as data protection expert working for the Belgian Supervisory Body for Police Information Management. And finally, Arne Hins will talk about research he has been doing on civic participation in the datafied society. And now I'd like to welcome Marion to give a short presentation.
Thank you very much, Rosamunde, for that kind introduction. And I should say at the beginning that I'm speaking in a personal capacity and not on behalf of the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner, the police, or any of my fellow committee members. Rosamunde asked us to think about a number of different questions for this panel, so I'd like to concentrate on 3 things. Firstly, giving you some context and background to the formation of the West Midlands Committee and why it was felt necessary to establish this new body. Secondly, how the committee operates and how it attempts to incorporate a range of views. And thirdly, just some of my own personal thoughts about some of the important things to consider about these types of approaches. Looking back on our initial time on the committee. So in terms of some background, West Midlands Police has established its own data analytics lab as an in-house faculty within the police and staffed by specially recruited data scientists employed by the police force. And the idea behind the lab is to explore how analytical techniques could help the police tackle some of the challenges they face. These are data scientists employed by the police force, and so they can work closely with operational officers to understand the operational need and then investigate if and how some sort of data-driven or technology approach might contribute. From what I've seen, the police are facing a number of challenges, especially in the current environment, around making connections, generating leads in the investigatory context, understanding why investigations might not be successful, and also prioritising activities where there might be the greatest threat to public safety. Many of the police officers I've met are very aware of their duties to the public and therefore feel that the police have a responsibility to make more effective use of the data that are available within police systems and potentially elsewhere. So the data scientists within the lab will work with operational police forces to understand these challenges and then consider whether data analysis might contribute. From the start of the project, both the police force and the Police and Crime Commissioner, which in England is effectively the political oversight of the police, they've been very aware of the potential legal and ethical questions that are likely to arise from the use of emerging technology and data analytics. And this is why the committee, the Data Ethics Committee, was established to work alongside the lab's projects and to give independent and transparent advice both to the Chief Constable and to the Police and Crime Commissioner as well. So following a public recruitment exercise, the committee was established with a number of different members with a wide range of expertise. So there are lawyers, both practicing lawyers and academic lawyers, members with ethics experience, computer and data science experts, again, both academic and commercial, a member with expertise in youth justice and the impact of custody on children, a member with an expertise in antisocial behaviour, a member with an interest in diversity and equality and the safety of citizens of Birmingham, those interested in police transformation and governance, a member with particular expertise in surveillance and human rights, and also representatives of the PCC. So we do have a body that aims to be able to consider issues that would be of concern to citizens and includes those who are associated with the region and are able to consider issues of particular relevance. So I suppose as a result, we are more of a sort of general oversight committee than a more traditional perhaps ethics committee might be. And the intention of the review process, which is set out in some quite detailed terms of reference, is to follow a project and evaluate that project from the initial concept through testing and initial implementation to operate, using the project in an operational context. So it's a process that's designed to try and address questions and issues at the start of the project rather than at the end or at a go live point. And I think this following through approach is really key, because often ethics processes tend to be one-off sign-offs and then so therefore may overlook the actual outcomes or implementations of a new approach or method. Ultimately, of course, though, our committee is reactive to the work of the Data Lab and other policing projects, and we've got no formal power to intervene or require information. There is, however, a commitment to transparency by both the PCC and the police, and a commitment that both the PCC and the Chief Constable will consider the committee's advice and provide reasons for not following the advice should they choose not to do so. The terms of reference for the committee has also includes a number of questions that are designed to ensure that the police and those working on the projects are considering some very key issues and factors, including those stemming from significant legal frameworks. So questions that the committee will also ask include those relating to how data sets are being used, how they relate to particular groups, and also crucially, it's not possible to consider any of this without thinking about how an algorithmic tool or a process will be used in practice in the field. And the minutes will show that the committee spent a lot of time exploring that. So my view as a lawyer, as you might expect, is that that law continues to be sort of the #1 priority in the consideration of AI and machine learning approaches within policing. But I do think that the West Midlands Committee approach can be vital in ensuring that issues such as necessity and proportionality are translated into considerations and questions that can be reviewed by those working in the field, and also that wider moral and ethical questions are considered alongside. However, this approach is not mandatory in UK policing, and if either the PCC or the police ultimately decided not to support the committee or discontinue the committee, that's not something that we could prevent. And so I would certainly support taking best practice from our approach and from other national approaches to think about how a more consistent and perhaps national approach could be developed for policing. And finally, just a few things to consider. One key factor, I think, about this type of oversight, which has been created proactively by the police themselves because of their understanding and appreciation of the newness and the potential controversy of the use of data analytics, is the question about what is the purpose of this body. And I think that has to be agreed and understood by everyone involved. Otherwise, you've got potential for conflicts and potential for the approach to fail. Secondly, how is transparency going to be handled? Is there a commitment by everyone involved to a significant transparent approach? How are you going to handle sensitive matters that inevitably might arise in a policing context? And then thirdly, what are the consequences of the advice? Who will take account of it? How will they take account of it? What if they disagree with it? What will happen in those circumstances? And is there an understanding that feedback that might be seen as potentially critical, for example, around scientific or statistical validity of an approach, or how to handle legal and ethical questions that might need changes to a project, is that seen as a negative thing or is it seen as a positive thing? My view is that it's really important to learn what doesn't work or what needs changing, as well as to address what does work. And finally, I would like to sort of emphasize that this whole approach is hard. It's really hard for those committee members involved in reviewing projects. It's hard for the police officers who have to think through an application and present their project to the committee. It's extremely time consuming, it's challenging mentally, and in terms of somebody's commitment, and it's hard for citizen volunteers to be involved in considering projects that are often very complex. So I think the work involved can't be underestimated in this respect. But overall, I think we've seen the process be a positive one for everybody involved, and I hope that will continue. And I think we've certainly found things that we can learn for the future, which I hope can inform other contexts as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. We go over now to Krien Eichmann.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm honored to speak here on behalf of my research group in Access to Justice, where we have some experience in doing research in terms of oversight for intelligence and security services. In my former life, I used to work for the Amnesty International Police and Human Rights Program, and I have a PhD in human rights and policing. I consider myself to be a legal sociologist, meaning I did a lot of research on what human rights law means for policing and practice. I'm also the deputy president of the Dutch Human Rights Institute for Human Rights, where we are currently involved in a strategic program in digitalization and human rights. Today, I'm speaking in my personal capacity, and I'm very honored to be here. Now, I was very excited about the presentation about how the Midlands, West Midlands Police in the United Kingdom implements kind of this human rights approach to accountability in the context of an external oversight. And I want to reflect a little bit on it because I think sometimes when we talk about oversight in the context of police practices from a human rights perspective, we often talk about accountability in terms of, let's say, the use of force. This is a very real discussion now in the Netherlands. We've had huge riots and protests the last couple of days. And when we talk in this context about the accountability for the police use of force, it's very often that it's perceived from an individual perspective. For instance, people can file a complaint when they feel that the use of force by the police was excessive. What is harder for individual, let's say, data subjects or individuals is to file a complaint in terms of surveillance, let's say the surveillance in terms of social media, which is used to anticipate to further riots. We've had riots 3 days and protests in a row in different cities, demanding a huge capacity from our law enforcement officials. And what is currently happening is that social media is monitored in order to anticipate to future riots. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is that from a police perspective, it's totally understandable that they do these kind of, that they use this kind of tools in order to prevent or to guarantee public safety and to enforce the law. Now, what is more problematic, if you look at the kind of external oversight, at least in many Western European countries, that the involvement of citizens in, let's say, oversight committees that review these kind of tools beforehand. This is something that is virtually non-existent. And I'm not arguing that it should be there, but in terms of the police cultures, especially in the Netherlands, the oversight of civilians, let's say, beforehand, so ex ante, is very rare, and this contradicts maybe human rights, a human rights perspective, where let's say oversight civilian boards, which exist in the United States but also in the United Kingdom, is seen as a very effective way to enforce human rights in the context of police practices such as the use of surveillance. At the same time, in a country like the Netherlands, the police are one of the few institutes that are highly trusted. Let's say on average, about 75% of Dutch people have high faith in the police as an institution. And my educated guess is that it also translates to the kind of tools they use to enforce the law. Of course, there is a minority that has far less faith in the police. These are usually people that who are subjected to ethnic profiling. And for these groups, you could argue that it would be more effective to include them in some kind of oversight. At the same time, the way the Dutch organize external oversight, this is usually done by external experts. If you look, for instance, at our overview board for the intelligence and security services, we have people who are appointed often with a legal background, to provide oversight beforehand. And in general, people do not question this type of oversight. This does not exist in the context of the police, who, for instance, use systems like what they call the criminal anticipatory prediction system, let's say the concept of predictive policing. And I've reviewed a lot of the literature in the Dutch context for this panel, and I've actually also not seen one academic proposing it. So from a human rights perspective, this is very interesting, and it's certainly something that should be reviewed. What has happened in the Netherlands is that since the last 2 years, we've had huge debate on the use of algorithms in our, let's say, more social policies context. So then we're talking about the detection of, let's say, social fraud or tax evasion, or etc. And we've just recently had a huge scandal with a kind of benefits to people who have childcare, who receive individual benefits to have their children in childcare so that they can work. There's been a huge fraud scam revealed, and since then we've had more debates in Parliament how algorithms should be used to make a risk analysis. And in Parliament, as well as outside of Parliament, you have oversight bodies who are saying, just like the United Kingdom, we should have specific oversight bodies in the context of the use of algorithms. Now, in our cultural context, that might not be such a bad idea, because we have currently a lot of legislation being passed where different government bodies and different private bodies share information. And this information can also be used by law enforcement bodies such as the tax police or the migration police or just the ordinary law enforcement officials. And I think if you look at human rights practice and human rights tools, for instance, let's say a recent report by the special UN Special Rapporteur on the existing forms of racism and racial discrimination, xenophobia. She recently wrote a report about emerging technologies and human rights. Her plea is actually that remedies should be effective. And I think what is effective in the context of oversight bodies within the police can be is very culturally determined. So even though I am quite positive of the in general about the including of civilian boards to provide oversight before surveillance tools are used, I personally think that in our cultural context, it wouldn't be a bad idea to include an expert committee, just like maybe the ethics committee in the West Midlands operate, because our experience is that there is a lot of technical information, and you need an interdisciplinary group of people to really understand if the surveillance tools are used in an appropriate way and they are necessary and proportionately. Furthermore, if you look at the conference we are here today, we are discussing obviously data protection. I've noticed, and this is more in my role as an oversight body such as the Dutch Human Rights Institute, most discussions in the context of surveillance are not in our country are not discussed from a data perspective, data protection perspective. They usually talk more about ethics or the design of technologies. And I think that we should oblige our police forces, our law enforcement forces, but also the rest of the government that is involved in surveillance, is to be a lot more transparent of what kind of surveillance tools they are buying, to be accountable to the public, what they are used for, if they're necessary, proportionate, etc. And that we should also obligate them that in the design of these algorithms that are used for surveillance technology, that they should meet certain standards, such as equality, such as privacy protective, etc. Now, last but not least, I think the police do not operate anymore in a vacuum. The cooperation between, at least in our culture, between the different kind of let's say, government services and private companies should be heavily regulated, because we all know in security that very often the surveillance is not conducted by the police themselves, but by other companies, private companies, that are doing it for them, let alone the public. Only 2 weeks ago, just after the riots in the United States, where the Capitol Hill was wasn't attacked by rioters, I had a call from some journalists for the United States, and they were saying this journalist was writing an article about the involvement of citizens in detecting who these people were that invaded Congress in the United States. Now, what is the point that I'm taking? Is that the cooperation between the public and the police in terms of detecting who these people are now currently in the Netherlands, in detecting who are involved in some of these riots, in some of them who are attacking the police. A lot of mistakes can be made, and these ethics considerations also by organizations like Bellingcat should be regulated, because otherwise we have a modern form of shaming people without proper checks and balances. So from my perspective, I think external oversight is excellent. At the same time, in a cultural context like the Netherlands, it could also be effective if you include an expert body that is not just giving permission for certain surveillance technologies beforehand, but is also monitoring it during the use of this surveillance technology. Now, to finish up, this has been a very difficult debate in our country. If you look at, for instance, a parallel to our law on the intelligence and security services, we tend to have a system that is highly legal, where a lot of lawyers are involved in oversight and accountability. And I think increasingly we should open this up to ordinary citizens, as well as people with a technical background, who can provide oversight in a more meaningful and a more effective way. I'm looking forward to the debate with the public and the rest of the members of my panel. At the same time, I would like to urge people to read a lot more about how accountability is experienced in practice by police officers, because I remember very well from a decade ago and currently when I'm involved in security research, that oversight and accountability is usually most effective for the ordinary rank and file if this is conducted by people who have some experience in law enforcement and in policing. And I think we should also question what is effective in practice from the perspective of the people who are doing the work, even though this is not always considered to be the most legitimate approach by the general public. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Kerien. Now we go to Koen Gorissen, who is a data protection expert working for the Belgian supervisory body for police information management. Thank you, Koen, for being here.
Thank you, Rosamunde. As you explained, I'm a member of the supervisory body for police information. We are quite a rare bird in Europe, as we are the only DPA specifically responsible for the police services. We are a DPA only for the police services and for the Belgian Passenger Information Unit. I will be speaking today on my personal capacity. I would like to give you a brief introduction about our organization, and I will talk about two examples of our investigations. So, as you might know, the GDPR and the LED, the Law Enforcement Directive, provide for the possibility to create multiple DPAs, as we did in Belgium. So we have one DPA who is competent for the public sector and the private sector, but the police services excluded, and we are the DPA for the police services. So we are the DPA since the entry into force of the data protection law in 2018. We are currently 11 people, 3 members as we are with the president, or president is a judge. We have one public prosecutor and myself as a privacy expert. Then we have an inspection service, which is composed by 2 members coming from the police services, one of the federal, one of the local police, and one privacy expert, and a secretariat with 2 lawyers, one ICT expert, and a secretary. Our competences can be seen as reactive or proactive. A reactive competence is the right of access. In Belgium, we have an indirect right of access for the citizens. So instead of going directly to the police, you have to come to us, to the supervisory body, and we will make an indirect access for you to the police services. For that, we have, for instance, a direct access to the police databases, which is very helpful to do our work. We treat more or less 400 files a year of this indirect access requests, which can have as a result that, for instance, some data in the police databases are erased or will be adapted if we see that it needs to be adapted. Another competence is answering to requests for information and advice. Those requests are coming both from unions, citizens, academics, and police services. It's a lot about privacy and data protection issues, sometimes about the application of the police law and law enforcement issues. We also have to make an opinion regarding legislative proposals. So if the government has a new law prepared regarding, for instance, the data management by police services, they have to come to us to have an opinion beforehand, before it goes to the parliament. So we will issue an opinion then. All these opinions are online. You can find them on our website. We also have a competence about unlawful processing by members of the police forces of police data. So, for instance, if they consult police databases for their own purposes, so not for their professional purposes, but just for themselves, we will check this out by check of the loggings, and if necessary, inform the public prosecutor or the internal affairs service of the police. Then a very important competence is more proactive. Those are the investigations we carry out. That is really our core business, and for that, it's really important that we have the police people. They have a lot of knowledge of the police databases and the police operations, so it's a very practical knowledge they bring to us, and that is really important for the investigations we make, because one constatation that was already made, it is very complex. You have different laws about police, about data protection that you have to apply. It's not a simple issue, so it's really necessary. We have those people. We have an ICT expert. We have lawyers to find everything out. We also have a security clearance because, of course, it's very important that if you investigate the police systems and the police operations in depth, we have a full access to the databases. You need this security clearance. You need this confidentiality towards the police to have the confidence also that what you are doing will be kept secret if needed. Some examples of those investigations. For instance, we made an investigation at the airport of Zaventem about use of facial recognition by the police services. On that occasion, we felt that processing was not legitimate, and we stopped the processing. So that's one of our competences. We can stop, if necessary, specific processing by the police services, and in that case we did. Another example is the use of drones by police services. We had a case in the end of last year with the COVID measures that were looked after by the use of drones by a specific police entity. So in that case, we also made an investigation on the ground. We checked how they work, and we made some recommendations in a report. So those were two examples of investigations we make. I guess it's quite important that you have that democratic oversight. So it's more or less by us executed, or we have to report to the parliament about our inspections, about our reports. So also the members of parliament have a voice in what we are doing. And to give another example, for instance, the use of video surveillance in a local community has to be approved by the city council. So that is an example, I guess, of democratic oversight, use of video surveillance in a specific local community. And they have to check the DPIA, for instance, that the police is showing them to justify the use of video surveillance in a local community. That was more or less in a nutshell what I would like to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Koen, for your presentation and explaining how the body works. Now to our final speaker is Arne Hins from the Data Justice Lab at Cardiff University. Arne, welcome.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone from Cardiff and Wales on the western end of the British Isles. I brought some pictures, some slides, so that you don't have to look at me all the time. I'm not sure exactly whether I will see them. I'll just go ahead and talk. So as Rosamund already mentioned, I'm working with colleagues at the Data Justice Lab at Cardiff University, where we try to connect data concerns with broader social justice issues. We're interested in the increasingly datafied, algorithmic, and automated governance of society. For example, we've researched the practice of citizen scoring and implications for surveillance and other issues. And following on from that, our current concern is how public participation in governing data can be advanced, and how the often obscure forms of data-based regulation can be democratized. Here are actually, on the next slide, are some of our recent projects in this regard, including the one that we're currently working on, which is about this very question that you see at the top here. We also have a conference coming up that's titled Civic Participation in the Datafied Society. And some of us work on or wrote a book actually recently about some related issues. And so what I'd like to do here is talk a bit more generally about oversight over data analytics and their role in the public sector, and how public participation plays a role in this. And I hope this may complement what others in this session have told us about the specific sector of police oversight. So I want to look at a specific part of our current research project that deals with oversight and advisory bodies in the UK, and then look at advancing participation through methods such as citizen juries and others. So the institutions in the UK that provide oversight Government advice and further expertise on data and AI include some of these that you see here. The Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, which is the UK regulator for information rights and data protection, and in that capacity also works with sector-specific regulators. Also the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, CDEI, which sees itself as a kind of meta regulator that encourages cross-sector regulation on data policies. Also, the Royal Society, a research-based institution for expertise and advice, has contributed to this debate. Similarly, the Alan Turing Institute, was created to focus specifically on data and AI. And also the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is more of a think tank that's more independent from government than the other institutions. It sees itself as a kind of deliberative body that provides expertise and fosters conversations with the public. All say they are representative of or accountable to the public interest. They all try to bring different stakeholders together, but none of them involve regular members of the public in their everyday oversight and advice. There is a recognition, though, that more public engagement is needed. For example, our interviewee from the Turing Institute clearly highlighted, quote, the need for deliberative democracy, participatory involvement, and co-production of policy. A prominent way of doing so have been citizen juries and citizen assemblies, if we could just go back to the previous slide, thank you. And other methods like deliberative polling and other methods that bring together generally a limited number of citizens, sometimes randomly selected, sometimes recruited to represent the diversity of a population for a few days of deliberation with expert input provided to teach participants about the issues. The Ada Lovelace Institute has run several such citizen juries on the use of biometrics data and facial recognition, and actually the top picture that you see here is from one of those. What they called the Citizens Biometrics Council engaged with 50 members of the public over several months to deliberate on how biometrics technologies should be governed and used also by police. And they called for a moratorium on the rollout of these technologies as a result. The ICO has been involved in citizen juries on AI decision-making in criminal justice and in recruitment and healthcare. Actually, the bottom picture here is from one of those in Manchester 2 years ago. The Royal Society ran public dialogue events on machine learning and automated decision-making. Actually, here on the left of this slide, you can see a very tentative, very incomplete list of some of those recent events. And so what this all this demonstrates, I guess, is a growing interest in and a growing need for participation in data-related decisions. There's been a strong interest for a while in academia in what's often called democratic innovation. There's a growing literature on new processes, models, and practices that advance citizen voices and decision-making outside and beyond the classic processes of elections. Particularly many publics models, such as citizen juries, but also other practices like participatory budgeting, direct legislation, and citizen-based policy development that has been by some described, for example, as crowd law or as policy hacking. And this has also generated interest among policy institutions, as we can see, for example, with the recent OECD report that was called Innovative Citizen Participation and New Democratic Institutions Catching the Deliberative Wave. And governments also have started to get interested. For example, the UK government now has an innovation in democracy program that tells local councils how to run a citizen assembly, for example. And this is a promising avenue, I think, also for issues around data and surveillance. Well, current oversight bodies have some limitations regarding participatory practices, and also citizen juries have many other limitations. They're often tied to a specific policy process, and they are commissioned often by government or larger think tanks, which means they can often influence policy, but their power in fundamentally questioning the use of data and moving the goalposts of the debate is limited. And there are usually one-off events that don't necessarily, say, institutionalize civic participation at a broader scale. But they may offer building blocks for a more participatory infrastructure of oversight and decision-making. If we combine different mechanisms from citizen assemblies on broader questions to citizen juries for specific decisions, to permanent oversight boards, and perhaps civilian and participatory boards and task forces similar to what other members of this panel have addressed. And so these are my kind of more general thoughts on, let's say, the broader context of the topic of today, focusing on questions of data and focusing on questions of participation. And I'll leave it at that here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Arne. I think we have heard a lot of perspectives from different countries and a lot of issues, and there are a lot of questions that can be discussed. I would like to start off with your views on if we consider the current way oversight of surveillance practices by police is organized from more in the sense of enforcing data protection law. Do you feel that this approach, but also the way that it has been implemented, is a sufficient approach to deal with the human rights implications and also maybe other societal issues that arise from using these technologies? And that's one. And secondly, how, if this idea of civic participation plays a role within this data protection framework, as it is hinted towards in the GDPR, specifically concerning data protection impact assessments, that it would be useful to involve stakeholders in the data protection impact assessments. Would it be useful to consider broadening this out and seeing where stakeholders and ordinary citizens could play a more active role in oversight bodies? Who would like to respond?
I'll make a few comments. Is that okay?
Yeah.
To your first question about current approaches and whether they are sufficient, I was thinking about the recent case law that we've had in the UK around the use of live facial recognition by the police, which went to the Court of Appeal. A very significant case around the use by South Wales Police of facial recognition technology. And I suppose what we have there is effectively an after the event process of challenge, and many of the oversight methods we have are that sort of after the event after the event process, either by a regulator or perhaps a body such as the inspectorate reviewing a police services compliance. So what's potentially missing is that process of some sort of independent scrutiny before a new tool or a new technology, a new method goes live, which potentially might have addressed some of the issues that came up in that particular case, for example. So yeah, that's some thoughts on that first question.
Can I just ask you, in your experience with the West Midlands Police, are they happy to think about these things before investing in a certain technology? Do they feel this is advantageous for their work? How are they responding to this way of working?
Yeah, well, I think yes, in generally there has been a very positive response to this process. I think what we all have to appreciate, though, is there's inevitably going to be a tension between what police forces want to do from an operational perspective and what they feel they need to address certain quite critical operational needs and a process of review. And so that's where the tension is potentially going to arise, I think. And so in setting up these types of bodies that review things along the way, that needs to be addressed right from the start, really, in terms of having the resources and having the ability to effectively keep track with that operational need.
Okay, Koen, could you comment on that from the Belgian perspective? Do you think that would be feasible, that the Belgian police, that there would be an ethics committee, such like there is at West Midlands Police? Do you think that the Belgian police would think that's a good idea, or?
Yeah, it might be a challenging issue, but in my experience, such a committee should have a possibility to enforce its opinion towards the police. It should not only be an advisory body, but it should also have a capacity to impose its opinion or to impose sanctions. That is what we are doing in any way. So if you don't have the possibility to enforce towards them, it's difficult to make them accept your point of view. And that is something that is necessary, I guess. We also have a possibility in Belgium of a prior consent or prior investigation. If there is, for instance, use of technology, new technologies by the police services, they should make a DPIA, of course, and also come to us with this DPIA and to have our opinion about it. So there we have a prior checking, more or less, of their operations.
Okay, and could you also comment on from your experience, this idea of involving other stakeholders in the data protection impact assessments? Is that something that is realistic at the moment?
Oh, it could be realistic, but as I said earlier, it's a really it's a complex issue. So you have the legal part, you have a technological part. It's not. You have the operational part. The question is, will the police give a full insight to a civilian oversight body about their operations? As I mentioned, for instance, we have a security clearance, so they can be more or less confident that we will not open up their operational details towards the public. Will you have the same guarantees with the civilian oversight? That is a question, I guess.
Marion, how is that in the UK? Do you have a security clearance and the members of the committee, or how does that work?
Yeah, the members of the committee are security cleared as a part of their appointment. We are all volunteers, however, and I think the difficulty for us, if we were to try and enforce our view, like Gruner was saying, is that we would then become a completely different type of body. Really, we're not set up as a regulator or as an enforcer, because we don't have any statutory basis or basis in law. So I think, although we do have that security clearance, and we can engage in some discussions about potentially sensitive matters, we don't have that enforcement role, but that we do have a terms of reference that sets out exactly how the PCC and the Chief Constable should respond to the advice, which makes it clear that has to be responded to in a formal way.
Corinne, you mentioned in your presentation that from your experience and research, it is very important to take into account the experiences of the police in accountability measures. How do you think, from a Dutch perspective, how the police in their daily jobs would appreciate having such a ex ante, before investing in the technology, a proportionality process that guides their work? How do you think they would respond to this?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask. To be honest, from the police studies literature, my expectation would be that the rank and file would not be very enthusiastic, because you were talking about the security clearance aspect, but I think security is something that is always perceived as something special and extraordinary. Now, this doesn't mean that it shouldn't take place. But the point being is, if we talk about effective practices, I think it should be made very clear how such an external oversight body is effective in terms of what the police wants to achieve in society overall. And I think sometimes it's difficult to communicate within the police why accountability is so important, even though higher up the police leadership does understand that legitimacy is a very important aspect in terms of law enforcement and policing in society. Now, I would also, if I may, add something to one of the questions that were asked, in the question about the current oversight from the data protection assessment perspective. For me, that's a very interesting perspective. Currently, the Dutch Ministry of the Interior is conducting a research in terms of impact assessment that is broader than just from a GDPR perspective, but it's a broader human rights perspective. And I think that's extremely interesting, because I do sometimes think that the human rights perspective or the data protection perspective have overlaps, but in practice there is much more than just the protection of data subjects. It's also about equality and racism, etc. And currently in our context, this is very important. Now, I think also in terms of the civic participation, the second question, if I may, I think we also have to always be concerned about the dictatorship of the majority. I was talking about the trust of Dutch people have in institutions, but especially in the police, but this does not apply to the entire society. So often the people who are subjected to surveillance practices or checks by the police are often from minority groups. So I think when we include stakeholders, we have to be very careful who they are and who they represent. And that's not always so easy in this day and age. But certainly, if we include experts, it should be people who at least have some familiar, or who have some understanding about minority group and the situations they are in. So it should be representative of the people most affected.
Thank you. I want to go to Arne. I don't know if you would like to respond to my question first, and then I ask another question.
To the first one, Yes, I found the answers very interesting, and I would just like to underline some of the points that were made. For example, by Marian about like the need for an ex-ante debate on whether, and maybe more fundamentally also whether and to what extent technologies should be used, rather than kind of a like legal legal case afterwards. Facial recognition was raised as an example here, and I think that's a great example to see how new surveillance technology is really becoming increasingly invasive, and the kind of the more experimental uses of this have created some troubles. And so yeah, there have been some examples and experiences, perhaps also with some specific task forces in other places that bring together different stakeholders, and sometimes offer some space for public involvement, although in a very limited way. There was, for example, in New York, there was the attempt to create such a task force for AI, which didn't work as well as it could have, but still there are interesting kind of, I think, ways of thinking about what to do about that. And the question of enforcement that was discussed then is an interesting one, but certainly it would be good to actually for these bodies then to have some form of power to intervene. Questions of procurement were also raised. I think that's also a very important question when we talk about this this topic. And again, it would be, as I mentioned, it would be really useful, I think, yeah, to see what actual power and well, thus such bodies have in terms of not just intervening into specific debate, into specific questions and decisions, but really the broader discussion on to what extent technologies should be used in the first place, and in what context.
Thank you. In following up, I'd like to ask you a question, because you are looking at oversight mechanisms more generally, of the use of automated decision-making systems and AI in society. Do you think that is a good approach, to have a more general oversight of the implementation of new technologies in society? Or do you think it would be more productive and useful that these oversight mechanisms happen in the different sectors, such as policing or social care? And in addition, do you feel that this is something that needs to be regulated nationally, or do you think the European Union might play a role in thinking about a more European perspective on oversight?
Yeah, the last question is an interesting one, especially like for us based in the UK right now, in the current context.
Or international, then you can also think about it more broader.
No, but both are interesting questions, and could really lead to a broader debate. It would also be interesting to see what others think about that. The first one is something that we're also trying to find out through our current research, which is still ongoing. I would say that the first one is a difficult one to tackle, and maybe those who are working practically in this field have a more informed opinion about that. I would say to some extent it depends, right? I think the examples where we see different institutions, different bodies working together and bring different expertise and levels and types of expertise coming in. For example, the the case was mentioned of different expertise on human rights, bringing that together with expertise on data protection and on policing and all of this, bringing these perspectives together is probably, I guess, what is needed. Even though in regulatory agencies or oversight bodies, for example, the ICO has people with particular expertise and looking at specific sectors, not just at the overall area, but still combining different types of institutions, different types of expertise is probably what is useful in this area, I would say.
Would anyone else like to respond to that question?
I'd add to that and suggest that, as Karina was saying, that the importance of having people on a body that have some understanding of the way that policing works, I think is really crucial. So I think there is a need for some focus on particular sectors. However, what I think we're seeing in the UK is there is a lot of interaction now between different types of data sources, and so there could be certainly an advantage of bringing together or having some way of different oversight bodies talking to each other and coming up with best practice. For example, we're hoping that the West Midlands model might inform some sort of national approach eventually, but then that also needs to learn from approaches that have been used in the statistical area and also in the medical side as well, particularly in the current circumstances. So I definitely think there's a need for sector expertise, but also learning best practice from other sectors as well.
Okay, Karine or Koen, would you like to respond?
Yes, for me it's more or less a no-brainer. Of course, I'm in favor of a sector-specific oversight body, as is foreseen. Also, you have the Law Enforcement Directive and the GDPR. So there is a reason, I guess, why they made two specific instruments, one specific for the law enforcement sector. So I would say yes. For me, it's there is a need for a sector law enforcement specific oversight body. As I mentioned earlier, it is really a key that you have people from the sector, from the police services, working in such a oversight body. As I mentioned, we have two people coming from the police who are fully aware of all the operational standards, how the police is dealing with personal data, etc. And that is really important that you have this this knowledge of the internal systems. If you don't have it, in my opinion, it's very, very difficult to enforce correctly the necessary legal standards.
Thank you. Karine, do you have any final points, because we need to finalize the panel?
A citizen of the European Union. No, I'm kidding. I really do believe in sector-specific ex ante, so prior oversight. And at the same time, I also want to raise awareness about the question if the actual surveillance technology or the information that is used or generated by surveillance technologies is sector-specific. I see another trend that information sharing between different government agencies as well as private-public cooperation is a reality also in the field of security. So even though I support sector-specific oversight, at the same time I recognize that in practice the surveillance tools are not limited to one sector as such, and especially in security, where the use of open source intelligence is very common, and agencies rely on what smaller companies are doing. I do think that we have to organize our oversight in terms of how society and technology is organized, and address oversight in that from that perspective as well. And whether that is conducted by existing oversight bodies or newly created bodies depends very much on a national society. And I don't think the European Union should direct how that should be organized, but should define how, the context. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all very much for being here today online. It was a pity we couldn't see each other in real life, but thank you for the great conversation, and I hope to see you all also next year, maybe in real life. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.